I would say the Tories are about 2 to 1 on to get the majority at the moment. So 66% probability.
Chances of a Labour majority?
As close to zero as to be effectively zero, but that's not what this election is about. This is election a choice between whether Boris Johnson gets a majority or not.
John, Matthew, welcome. Very nice of you to give up your time in the middle of a load of briefings you're doing, wall-to-wall briefings every day at the moment. And you join us in a very strange back room at
welcome to higher education, Gary.
at King's in London, which looks like a graveyard for old lighting systems and tripods, a few random chairs, but no two random guests, two very finely selected guests, and thank you for sparing the time to join us. I want to ask you first about the Brexit Party's decision to stand down. I call it the Brexit Party. Nigel Farage's decision that Brexit Party candidates should stand down in Tory-held seats. What impact is that, possibly the only real thing that's happened in this election so far, what impact is it going to have? Matthew?
Well, I think if you look at what Boris Johnson needs to do, first of all, he needs to run a defensive strategy, holding a lot of the seats that that the Conservatives won at the last election, but he also needs to run an offensive strategy going into those Labour Leave seats. Now, on the surface, some observers have argued that Nigel Farage's decision to stand down in existing Conservative-held seats doesn't make that much difference, because by still standing in those Labour-held, often pro-Leave seats, that's where the Brexit Party is still going to be an obstacle for Boris Johnson. I'm not entirely sure I buy that. If you look at the 50 smallest majorities for the Conservative Party, 35 of those are in Leave seats, and the Conservative MPs not having to run against Brexit Party candidates that might otherwise take 2, 3, 4% of the vote is going to make their job of holding those seats easier. But it's also true that now having a Brexit Party candidate still standing in crucial seats, Southampton, Itchen, Dudley North, those kinds of places, is going to be a complication for Boris Johnson. I mean, I looked this morning at some of the seats in 2017, even when UKIP were almost wiped out, there were 10 constituencies where still UKIP polled a higher share of the vote than the Labour majority, suggesting that the Conservatives, Theresa May, might have gone a lot further in some of those areas had they not had the UKIP competitors. So I think this is a significant moment.
On balance, John, where are you on this one?
Well, I mean, for the reasons that Matthew's just explained, it's not as a dramatic transformation of the Tory prospects as perhaps the initial headline suggested, assuming, of course, that the decision in itself doesn't damage the credibility of the Brexit Party in the places where it's still standing. And to be honest, given that it's a party that has been on the decline on a pretty continuous basis since the summer, it might be true in any case that by the time we get to the 12th of December, even if Nigel Farage hadn't made this decision, maybe the Brexit Party would not be that important, question mark.
The air's going out of the balloon maybe a bit.
Who knows? Yeah, but equally Nigel Farage, once he's actively campaigning, might be expected to put some more air back in the balloon, who knows? But I mean, the area where I don't think it will make a great deal of difference to the Tories' ability to hang on to the seats in Scotland they're trying to hang on to, where the Brexit Party will not fight, because there aren't that many Brexit Party voters. The terrain where it probably will make a bit of a difference, perhaps, is the seats that the Liberal Democrats are hoping to take off the Tories. Some of which, of course, are very pro-Remain and one would expect to make a difference, but others are not. Now, in truth, there is a question mark about the extent to which the Liberal Democrats will do well in some of their traditional strongholds where they still have a good second place, such as North Cornwall, North Devon, St Ives, but where they're also very substantial Leave areas. So and given that all of the increase in the Liberal Democrat vote since 2017 has occurred amongst Remain voters, maybe at the end of the day, they're not going to win these anyway. But certainly the Brexit Party standing in those kinds of places will not make it any easier for Liberal Democrats to pick up. And maybe one way to think about it is that, of course, this wasn't the first decision about candidates announced in the campaign. The thing that was announced before that, the previous week, was that there was going to be something Remain alliance between the Liberal Democrats, the Greens and Plaid. Now, small beer because these are small parties, but certainly the Greens not standing in some of the Liberal Democrat prospects, and also Plaid not standing in Montgomery and in Brecon, it was not unreasonable to argue that maybe they would have picked up a half a dozen seats as a result of that. Well, it may be just that Nigel Farage has just simply negated that side of a pact forming on the Remain side of the argument.
You've watched Nigel Farage particularly closely, Matthew. I just wonder, do you think, the final chapter that we're looking at. He looked in a quandary from the moment this election was called. He didn't seem comfortable. His stomach didn't seem to be, heart didn't seem to be quite in it. Do you think it probably is the last chapter before he goes off to be a disc jockey in America or whatever?
Who knows? I think we had that discussion in 2015 when, of course, UKIP polled nearly 13% of the vote and in the end walked away with only Clacton. I think it's very difficult to know where our Brexit divides are going to end up. We don't really know what the outcome's going to be in December. I think it's entirely plausible that the hard Eurosceptic tradition in Britain remains relevant over the next few years, particularly as we go into those trade negotiations. I think one of the unwritten laws in British politics really since the late 1990s onwards is don't underestimate Euroscepticism in this country. What was interesting, I actually spoke to Nigel Farage earlier this week for a piece I was writing. I think it's quite clear that one of the key aspects of the last week really relates to some of the donors within the Conservative Brexit Party camp. There is a very strong sense of disquiet about the prospect that the Brexit Party are potentially going to stop Johnson from winning a majority and by extension stop Britain from effectively leaving the European Union. That pressure, I think, has been very real for him. But when he says the Brexit Party do better in Labour areas and Conservative areas. One thing is he genuinely believes that, even if the data is a bit more complex. We've looked at the 2015 election. For every one vote that UKIP took from Labour, they took 3 from the Conservative Party. So where they stand, they are disproportionately hitting the Conservatives. And that fact, that reality, I think remains true.
Yeah, and of course it's also worth bearing in mind that the Tory vote now is much more pro-Leave than the Tory vote in 2015. So that's even more bound to be the case.
Yeah.
He won't get as much coverage, will he? Because he's not standing in all the seats. The broadcasters are required to sort of trim the coverage a bit, and that could impact on things. But surely the biggest impact here is that he's borrowed, he's actually mouthed the Tories' attack line on him. They were saying a vote for the Brexit Party risks remain, risks a second referendum, and he said it from his own lips. That must bleed into his support in those seats where he's still standing, mustn't it?
That's the risk he's taking. But of course, you know, the truth is, as you've just said, he has this belief that he can win Labour-held seats that the Conservatives can't. And if you listen to what he said very carefully, his strategy that he's trying to deliver is to become the DUP of the next Parliament. That is, by only standing down in the seats that the Tories won last time, he's kind of thinking, well, maybe that's all they'll get. Maybe they will still lose some of them. If I can pick up half a dozen Labour seats that the Tories can't win, and the Tories are short of 326, and I can take them over the line, then I'm able to hold the government hostage in much the same way as Arlene Foster has tried to hold the government hostage for the last 2 years. That is what he has said. He has said publicly. Now the question is,
as we sit here now, the chances of that?
No, I think, to be honest, the chances of the Brexit Party winning anything anywhere, I was close to zero as anything is. And
you're nodding, Matthew.
But he has this exaggerated belief in the ability of his party to pick up voters from the Labour Party, and that indeed he can pick up votes from the Labour Party in much more effectively than the Tories can. But actually, if you look at the polling in recent weeks, as many people have been going from Labour to Conservative as they have been going to the Brexit Party.
One lesson from recent history that I think we might come back to reflect on the day after the general election, the Hayward and Middleton by-election 2014, what happened there? UKIP and Farage ran the Labour Party very close, but ultimately failed, even within a by-election scenario, to take that Labour seat. Why am I pointing at that? Here you have an election where a pro-Brexit Conservative Party is deliberately targeting Labour Leave seats, arguing that that is their pathway to a big majority. What did Labour throw at Nigel Farage and UKIP in 2014? This is a party that wants to privatise the NHS. This is a party that is in cahoots with far-right populists in Europe. This is a party that's Thatcherite, that doesn't stand up for the economic interests of Labour voters. What are Labour doing now to the Conservatives? Same strategy. Boris Johnson wants to do dodgy free trade deals with the US. Boris Johnson is Trump, he's hard right, etc., etc. I actually think that by-election in Hayward and Middleton might come to be seen as something of a trailer for what's going to happen in these Labour Leave seats. Because remember, Theresa May, going back 2 years, the average Conservative vote in those Leave seats went up by about 11 points, but Labour's vote went up too by about 5 or 6 points. One reason for that, I think is because the economic redistribution questions still matter, and because of that Labour strategy is quite effective. And could it be that Boris Johnson suffers the same fate in Walsall, Stoke North, Dudley North, where actually voters look at Boris Johnson, they look at Jacob Rees-Mogg, and they think, well, I agree with them on Brexit and migration, but in terms of the economic left-right questions, are these guys really on my side? And that, I think, is going to be crucial.
But hang on, there's another way of looking at what happened in 2017. Sure, the Labour vote went up in Leave areas, but the Conservative vote went up a lot more in Leave areas than it did in Remain areas. And in the most Leave areas, the Labour vote, the Tory vote went up more than did the Labour vote. And the reason why seats like Workington and Bishop Auckland are now marginal seats, this is Theresa May's legacy. These are seats that swung to the Conservatives against the national tide and has helped to make them marginal. So although the Tories may not have won many of these seats, they actually made significant progress such that they are now potential plums for Boris Johnson to win. But then also remember, actually, Boris Johnson could win these seats without gaining a single vote. Because again, the other thing we know about these seats is that 60% of the Labour voters in these seats voted to remain. I did this 2 years ago, and the British Election Study has recently repeated the analysis. And one simple pathway by which Boris Johnson gets some of these seats is he recreates the coalition he had last time, or rather Theresa May had last time. And then some of the Remain Labour vote wanders off to Democrats, which is what's happening nationally. Labour vote falls, Tories hold still, bingo, Tories win. So the Tories could win these seats without persuading a single voter who didn't vote for them last time to vote for them this time. And again, this takes us back to the crucial psephology of this election. The election looks like it is, not because the Conservative Party is more popular than it was 2 years ago. It isn't. It's still, even now, about 4 points shy of where it was in 2017. What's crucial to this election is that 60% of Leave voters are saying they're going to vote Conservative, and only just 40% are going to vote Labour. And that is what is going to determine the outcome, because actually, if you add up the total vote for parties in favour of the EU, a second EU referendum, at the moment, it's 52%. The total vote for parties in favour of Brexit, 47%. That's roughly what the polls suggest will be the outcome of a referendum at the moment. It's the differential split on the two sides that's absolutely fundamental to this election, and that is a split that could well play out in the seats that Labour are trying to defend against the Tories in particular.
But are we seeing, we've said Brexit Party decision, Nigel Farage's decision was virtually the only major event that there's been in this campaign so far. But in terms of looking at the polls, aren't we also seeing a bit of Labour creeping up?
Yes.
And one of the things that occurs to me is that the Tory attack line on Labour used on their leaflets, which is vote Labour, get a second referendum, is actually the line that Labour's using in its seats.
Sure.
They are the People's Vote candidate, as my local leaflet in Finchley and Golders Green said,
No, sure. Well, I mean, essentially, something happened the moment the election was called. There was a shift.
Just like last time.
Yes, yes, except last time the shift was from UKIP to Conservative. There wasn't an immediate rise in the Labour vote last time, just when the election was called. So what happened this time? I mean, we had yet another tranche of Brexit Party voters going back, most of them to Tories, few of them to Labour. But what we did happen was, a small, but it was the first movement on the Remain side since the back end of May, whereby the Labour vote goes up from around 38% amongst Remain voters up to about 42, 43. And the Liberal Democrat vote splits goes down from the low 30s down to around 29% or so. If it happened once. There isn't any evidence since then that anything has happened on that side of the fence. So, so far, apart from that movement, not much has happened in this election within the electorate so far as the polls are concerned. And of course, a lot of people are looking at this election, well, of course, look what happened in 2017. There was enormous movement. Well, lightning doesn't always strike twice in the same place. Maybe it will, but there is no guarantee that we will end up with an election campaign which proves to be volatile, despite the backdrop of the last 12 months and despite what happened in 2017. We might, but there is no guarantee. And so far, it's not been. And I think more broadly, perhaps one of the reasons why this election seems rather dull is, of course, we've had the whole parliamentary shenanigans of the last 6 months. For anoracs like us, it's been absolutely riveting, and it's been, move, counter move, counter move, counter move. And it's been very dramatic and very exciting. I mean, in comparison, a general election campaign like this has been extraordinarily dull, as we get one party telling us about they're going to spend money on childcare. Another one says, no, we're going to spend it on social care. Another one says, well, you can't believe anything that these parties are saying because it's all a load of rubbish. It's all rather banal and dull as compared with the drama of the Brexit.
But I'm happy to report applications to study politics are up 30%.
Well, of course, that's one of the many indicators that indeed we are now rather interested in politics as a result of Brexit. And perhaps one of the reasons why turnout, despite all of the fears and concerns, may well go up.
Let's just briefly touch on that. Two politics academics here. Are they rubbernecking at an accident on the motorway when they come to study politics, or are they dreaming of a new future? Is a generation of people who want to make it better?
Well,
what is it?
I wrote about this last weekend because if you look at our first-year students, there's a big assumption out there. I hear it all the time that there's going to be another youthquake because of tuition fees and because of Brexit. A couple of things to bear in mind. Number one, the research on what happened in 2017 would suggest that the effects of the youthquake were wildly exaggerated. Number two, our first years were born in 2001. They weren't eligible to vote in the 2016 referendum. They weren't eligible to vote in the 2017 general election. This is the first real election they can vote in. They have been observers of the Brexit culture wars. They have not been active participants of the Brexit culture wars. They want to talk about climate change. They want to talk about environmentalism. If you look at when the election is held, I mean, really fascinated to see the turnout rates across different generations. The election's on the Thursday. That's the last week of teaching at my university. Most students typically would have been gone by then. They typically leave. They might be in a lecture, a seminar Tuesday, Wednesday. And if you look at stated intention to vote, we still currently have the 25, 30 point gap between the 18 to 24s, the over 65. Age is a more important driver of vote choice in British politics, but people always forget the reason age is more important is not just because the young are more aligned to Labour, it's also because older voters are more aligned to the Conservatives. And as a consequence, we may see, again, these big divides in turnout.
But if you're a party looking to inherit the next demographic, you should probably focus on environmentalism, not remain.
No, I don't know what John's view is, but if you want to focus on a key demographic at this election, I would argue it's 30 to 49-year-olds for the simple reason
I just meant for the future. If you're looking for a youth,
sure. But the reason I say that group is because that was the group that swung the hardest against the Conservatives in 2017. That's the group that does worry about childcare, that does worry about generation rent, the things can only get better generation, grew up under Tony Blair and New Labour. That's the group I think that's going to really matter at this election.
Though the new young voters do also matter. I mean, it's very clear the Labour Party is much more popular amongst the younger end of the population than it is among the older. And that, one of the reasons why the Tories are not ahead in the polls more than they are, and why they're not back up to the level of support in 2017, is that they've basically got their vote back up amongst Leave voters, but they're still behind on Remain voters, and they're still behind on those people who didn't vote 3 years ago, which would include the folk that Matthew was referring to, and that's where the deficit in the Tory performance as compared with Theresa May still arises.
Let's go back just to what the polls have been telling us so far, if they're telling us anything, and the idea that the two main parties they've definitely crawled back from where they were in the European Parliament elections, but they've crawled back even from the very beginning of the starting gun going on this election, haven't they?
Well, to a degree. I mean, don't exaggerate. I mean, the Tories were already, if you take the week before the election, they were already running at 37, 38, while they're now running at 38, 39. The Labour Party has gone up from a position where it was flatlining at 25 for a long time. It's now crept up to about 28. So it's not dramatic, but yeah, the point about on the Labour side,
smaller parties are going down a bit, and the two big ones going up.
It's the first time that anything had happened on the Remain side for 6 months. But whether it will go any further, who knows?
If you look at where we were a month out from the 2017 general election, Labour were averaging 28%, and now today they're on 28, 29. So there are two schools of thought emerging. One is we're about to enter into this incredibly volatile period of churn and change where the Lib Dems and the Greens and the Brexit Party are all squeezed. Two-party politics reasserts itself. The other school of thought that John alluded to is maybe we've got so preoccupied with volatility, maybe actually just we're going to have this fairly stable picture all the way through to the election. We don't really know, but it means we do need to treat all of the forecasts and predictions with caution.
Yeah, and I think what is important to understand is that, insofar as lots of people are saying, well, look, the Labour Party is starting from the same position, but looked at where they ended up. And it's worth being aware that the strategic situation facing the Labour Party is rather different from what it was 2 years ago. Number one, their task is not so much to get votes back from the Tories, though they have lost some. Their principal loss of support, and the reason why they're so low in the polls, is they've lost folk to Liberal Democrats, amongst whom Remain voters. How are they going to get them back? Well, presumably by persuading Remain voters that they are the best choice on Brexit. And there the Conservative Labour Party's problem is that folk struggle to understand Labour's position on Brexit, whereas most remarkably, a lot of people understand where the Democrats stand, and this is not something that's very common. The second thing, of course, is in 2017, Jeremy Corbyn was the only decent campaigner. Theresa May fell flat on her face.
Tim
Farron was useless, and it was. Matthew here will remember, but most people will not remember that the leader of UKIP at the last election was one Paul Nuttall.
Indeed.
Yes, yeah. Right. Okay. Now we've got Boris Johnson, who. It's an interesting character, but certainly it has a much more of a presence than Theresa May. Nigel Farage, one of the most charismatic politicians in our country. And although perhaps Jo Swinson is not necessarily in the same league, she's certainly better than Tim Farron, and she has better numbers than Tim Farron.
She does have the revoke policy, though, and I wonder to what extent has the revoke policy alienated moderate
No sign
voters.
of it so far. I mean, the truth is, if you give people the choice between the two options, more people choose revoke on the Remain side, choose revoke than a referendum. So insofar as what she's going for is a core vote, and her core vote are the hard Remainers. That's why she's going there. The third thing, of course, which is different, is that everybody's discovered the magic money tree that Theresa May couldn't find. That the Tories have dropped austerity. But
how much of that has penetrated with former Labour voters?
But the interesting point is that insofar as the Labour Party is wanting, therefore, to come up with an attack on the government, it is now much more difficult for them to simply repeat the lines of 2017 and to say, look, all these guys, want to cut public services, etc., etc. That is determinately not the message that the Conservative Party is trying to bring forward. It does, therefore, mean you need to have a more subtle line of attack. So, for example, sure, the Conservative Party wants to increase more money on schools, but amongst whom do they most wish to increase it? Well, it's in schools in better off areas in Tory shires, because they're the ones who've had less in the way of an increase under both the Coalition and under the Labour Party, which has tended both governments concentrated resources on schools with high levels of kids from multiply deprived backgrounds. So you've got to change the attack. You've got to say, it's no good saying these Tories simply want to deny you public service. You kind of got to say, well, actually, whose public services are going to benefit from the Tories? And I'm not sure the Labour Party, at the moment at least, have got past the stereotypical view that they have of the Conservative Party, which I understand, to actually looking at what is the Conservative Party actually saying now, and what are the lines of attack that might be effective given what they're saying now. So all of these things, anyway, the point is that these are three ways, the difference in the Tory message, the difference in the Tory leader, and the difference in the fact that the Labour Party's the party that's challenging at most of votes. These are all different from 2017, and so therefore these three reasons as to why we can't assume, at least, that the Labour Party will pull off the same trick twice.
Nancy, do you think the perception amongst former Labour voters of the Tory party has had enough evidence, time to change?
Well, if you look at the class breakdowns, I just put some out on Twitter today, that you've got about 43% of sort of C2DE voters, working class voters, saying they're going to vote Conservative. Pretty good numbers for the Conservatives among that group. Of course, the Conservatives historically have always had a significant amount of support from the working class. People tend to forget that. The C2s, Margaret Thatcher's Essex Man, for example, the sort of aspirational self-employed plumbers, electricians and so on. What's interesting to me about this campaign, which it relates to the underlying fundamentals, is we already knew from the long-term data story that British voters were basically giving up on kind of what you might call Singapore on Thames, right? Sort of low regulation, low tax. So if you look at the National Centre for Social Research, it showed that, particularly over the last 2 years, a greater number of voters wanted taxes to increase to spend more on public services. And so the underlying fundamentals of British politics, you could argue, have become more favourable for Labour. Enter Corbynomics, a more radical agenda. Let's nationalise rail, water, gas. Let's have workers on company boards. Let's increase taxes on the 5%. Let's get rid of non-doms, all that sort of stuff.
All of which is popular.
All of that stuff is very, very popular right now. But the problem is we also now live in a world where competence really, really important, really matters to voters. If you flip that coin and you ask voters, who do you trust to manage the economy? Who do you think would lead us into recession? Who do you not want to be in the Treasury? That's where Labour's still getting hit. It's still not keeping pace with the Conservatives. So people like Corbynomics, even though they're wary of Jeremy Corbyn, but they're still sceptical about Labour's ability to deliver on the economy.
Yeah. A different leader at the head of the Labour Party right now.
Game changer. Total game changer.
Yeah, perhaps, though it needs more than a leader to persuade people that you're going to a competent party. You do actually need to have a narrative of what you're going to do, and you need to have a collection of people who you think are going to be capable of delivering. So, Jeremy Corbyn is undoubtedly proving to be disadvantaged for the Labour Party so far as the party's appeal is concerned. But the Labour Party always struggles, relatively speaking, most of the time in persuading people that it's capable of running the economy, etc., etc. The one occasion when this was not true was in the 1990s in the wake of the ERM crisis, which just destroyed the Tories' reputation on competence. Much of that is now ancient history. And of course, the Labour Party is still suffering from having been sitting in the chair in the financial crash of 2008. So therefore, that's still a memory that's associated with the party.
And how many majorities have Labour won in the post-war era without Blair? And Blair was very, very adept at trying to present that economic competence. I think it's 3.
Yeah, he was also very lucky. The electoral system was operating in his favour. And you do have to remember that Tony Blair only got 36% of the vote in 2005. Yeah. He only got it because the electoral system was so kind to him.
As we speak, Jeremy Corbyn's in Scotland. John, what do you make of where Scotland is heading in this general election? There was bold talk not so long ago of the SNP sweeping the board. How does it feel to you?
Well, the crucial thing you have to appreciate is that the election in England and Wales is an election between two parties that are currently both losing. Okay, this is not a question of who's going to gain most. It's going to be a question of who loses least. England and Wales, that's fine, because there's nobody else who's capable of profiting from the difficulties that both of them are finding in getting themselves back to the levels of popularity that they had in 2017. North of the border, there is a party called the Scottish National Party, which is A, dominant, and B, if anything, is more popular now than it was back in 2017. On average, the polls give them about 40% of the vote, which is about 3 points up on last time. The polls north of the border, such as they are, and they are limited, have been showing Conservative and Labour both down, because that's what you'd expect, because that's what's happening to the Conservative and Labour parties elsewhere. It may now be that the fall in the Conservative vote is a little bit less, when frankly we need a bit more polling to verify that. But also, virtually every seat in Scotland is marginal. Very small shifts of votes can result in substantial turnovers of seats. And at the moment, at least, one has to say, one would expect the SNP to return at the next Parliament with more MPs than they have at the moment. I mean, maybe 45 is a reasonably central forecast. And that as a result, that even if the Democrats do rather better than some expectations, they'll probably still be the third largest party inside the House of Commons. And that certainly the Labour Party in particular look to be, if your vote's down 12 points across the UK as a whole, surprise, surprise, the polls suggest it's down about 6, 7, 8 points north of the border. And the Labour Party, could well be struggling seriously. And meanwhile, the Tories might get away with hanging on to half of the 13 seats they had, but they'll do well to do much more than that. So it's the SNP what profit.
Is there much concern about a winter election in Scotland in particular? And are you seeing any impact, either of you, or do you predict any impact of
weather?
Weather and darkness and much else besides.
Well,
Christmas distraction.
Well, but I mean, the answer to the quick answer to you is that the highest turnout in a post-war British election was on the 23rd in election on the 23rd of February 1950, when we had an 84% turnout. And we only had one other winter election, which was on the 28th of February 1974, when it really was winter and it really was dark and it really was cold, because we had a coal miners' strike and the lights were being turned off on a regular basis. Therefore, you're on coal fires, or that was it, and it was homework by candlelight, right? So,
what's the turnout?
As compared with 79% turnout.
But the stakes were high.
Sure, but then there is a really interesting, boring technical thing behind this. Back at that stage, we introduced a new electoral register on the 15th of February. So both of these elections were fought on new registers, which therefore means the register is fresher, and put it at its simplest, there are fewer dead people on the register. This time, now we introduce the new register on the 1st of December. So this election will be fought on a very fresh new register, which itself will artificially raise the official turnout because there will be fewer dead people, all right? So to that extent, at least, there's an artificial thing. Now, beyond that, the answer to is we don't know. The last time we had an election in December was 1923, but in 1923, Scotland would not have had a holiday on Christmas Day, England would not have had a holiday on New Year's Day, and certainly Christmas, the midwinter, the major midwinter festival we now have, whereby we shut down the country for 2 weeks, and we spend the 2 weeks before that celebrating the fact we're going to shut down the country for 2 weeks. That is a modern invention, and to that extent, at least, we have no precedent for doing it in these circumstances. But that said, we do know from parliamentary by-elections that the closer you get to Christmas, the turnout does tend to fall away, and that is a warning sign. But of course, parliamentary by-elections are not the most exciting contest.
If it did, who benefits?
Anyway. Oh, that's not obvious. I mean, basically, just assume that everybody loses. But at the end of the day, I mean, given how engaged we are, we've already talked about how people are much more interested in politics. We also know that a lot of people really feel passionately both about Remain and Leave. That should help bring voters to the polls. And at the end of the day, there is a kind of simple point here. So we're all kind of going, oh, we're such fragile creatures. We can't possibly get to the polling station in the middle of December. But of course, we can go Christmas shopping, we can go and stand out the cold and watch the Christmas lights, we can take our kids to the Nativity Play or the Santa's Grotto. I take it if we can do all those things, then the middle of December, presumably we can take it ourselves to a polling station, which in most cases is usually much closer than Santa's Grotto or the Christmas shopping.
Ho, ho, ho. So it won't be an election of the living dead. That's good. Matthew, what will it be, the result? Let's start with the possibilities of a Conservative majority. What percentage chance do you put on that?
Oh, well, I tried this at the last election and it didn't go very well. Look, I mean, I think if you take all of the evidence that we have to date and you take all the polling and you look at what we're seeing during the campaign until now, then the most likely outcome would be a Conservative majority of some description.
Not necessarily a massively comfortable one.
No, I don't think that. No, I don't think that. I still would not at all be surprised if we end up with another hung parliament. I think in some of the polls lately over the last week, the Conservative lead has come down to 6-7 points. There are lots of things that can go wrong for Boris Johnson. John has alluded to the Conservatives possibly losing ground in Scotland. I've talked about Labour Leave seats not going well for the Conservatives. The Remain fragmentation perhaps beginning to rectify itself, Labour squeezing down on the Lib Dems. Don't forget there are going to be a lot of voters on the Remain side that are going to now be zooming in at their local constituencies and thinking, what is the most plausible outcome in this seat, even if it's on the day itself. And then, of course, you've got Labour most likely still doing well in London, continuing its spread out to some of the commuter towns. What if there are a couple of problems for the Conservatives in the southwest blue wall? And what happens? It's not hard basically to see then. Well, if you put the Brexit Party in at 4-5%, perhaps Farage has a good campaign. Perhaps we are underestimating how toxic the Tories are in lots of those Labour seats. Then we're in hung parliament. territory again, or potentially some other scenario that we're not forecasting. So as things stand today, with almost a month to go, Conservative majority, perhaps a small one most likely, but everything's on the table, I think.
Would you agree with that, John?
Yeah, I would say the Tories are about 2 to 1 on to get the majority at the moment. So 66% probability.
Chances of a Labour majority?
As close to zero as to be effectively zero. But that's not what this election is about. This is election a choice between whether Boris Johnson gets a majority or not, because leaving, with the possible exception of the DUP, who are now in the we don't like Boris Johnson's deal and we'll vote against that, but we're not quite sure where they stand on having another referendum. Everybody else is in favour of a second referendum. And so basically, if once Boris Johnson is anything more than just a little bit below the 326 mark required for an overall majority, his ability to remain in office becomes increasingly tenuous, because there will end up being a sufficient group of people who, if they want to have a second referendum, are going to put a minority Labour administration in. And Labour Party doesn't have to get more seats than the Tories. They just simply need to get Boris below 315, definitely it. Below 320, pretty tough. So at the end, this is pretty much a binary election. Hung Parliament, then we're almost undoubtedly heading towards an extension and a second referendum, and Lord knows what the outcome of that will be. Or we get a majority and we go out on the 31st of January and Boris is charged with the task of negotiating a alternative outcome. And that's essentially the way. Ironically, at the end of the day, we've kind of stumbled into this election, but as the way it's turning out, it's actually providing us with a fairly clear binary choice, at least so far as the implications of the various outcomes are concerned.
Brexit or referendum?
Yeah, essentially. And I think one of the interesting things, I mean, if you look to the Conservative Party now, where do you think they're most vulnerable in terms of the plan for that majority going wrong? Because I still think the Labour Leave seats are far more complicated than some of our commentary would have us believe. I mean, I've spent a lot of time in those seats when you and I were watching the rise of UKIP in the Haywards and Middletons and the Hartlepools and so on. And people tend to forget how embedded those anti-conservative traditions really are.
Well, you know, I mean, the Tories did manage to win Copeland in a by-election not so long ago, and they managed to hang on to it in the general election, didn't they? I mean, sure. I mean, the things that can, as I already suggested, the things that can go wrong for Boris is essentially what happens on the Remain side of the fence, and one of the ironies of this election from the beginning has been that. Jeremy Corbyn needed Nigel Farage to do well, and that ain't working out too well. And Boris Johnson needed Joe Swinson to do well, because the better that Joe Swinson does, the easier it's going to be for Boris Johnson to get a majority. But on how well, now Boris Johnson can take some responsibility for Nigel Farage's fate, but he has no control over Joe Swinson's success or otherwise. But it's, in a sense, it's almost in her hands as to whether he makes it or not.
Matthew, John, thank you very much indeed for sharing your thoughts.